Notre prochain invité, Martin Guhn, est professeur, j'ai pratiqué mon allemand. Il est professeur adjoint à l'École de santé publique et des populations de l'Université de la Colombie-Britannique. Il arrive juste il y a comme quelques heures. Il a pris l'avion cette nuit, alors on va être indulgent. Il n'a pas dormi beaucoup. Et il travaille depuis maintenant près de 10 ans au Human Early Learning Partnership, HELP, où le test, l'IMDPE, a été utilisé à plusieurs reprises. Alors, on accueille avec beaucoup de plaisir Martin.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's great to see the large audience here. I was asked or invited to talk about the following topic: promising practical avenues and actions for child development. So, as you just heard, I've been doing research on child development, particularly using the EDI for the past 10 years. Originally, I should say I'm from Germany, then I moved to Vancouver. So I've been 11 years in Vancouver. I've done research with the EDI. And so even though it's primarily has been empirical research, of course, I've over time gotten an impression of what people are doing. And that's why I try to give you a little bit of a integration of what the research is saying and what is happening in the province and what the bigger picture is. And then of course, I'm very curious to hear what your reactions, responses are. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge Clyde Hertzman. I don't know how many of you have met him or know him. I would like to acknowledge him for two reasons. He died too early, 1.5 years ago. He was my mentor at UBC. He's the reason I stand here and can talk about this. He built the EDI project in BC. And so that's the one reason I particularly want to acknowledge him. The other reason is if we talk about what things can make a change, well, often it's individual people or a small group of people and their initiative. I mean, and he was a prime example of that. The way he went out to communities, talked about the importance of brain development, the early years, and community action and social activism was just phenomenal. So I think it's inspiring in the sense that if we see other people make a big of a difference by themselves or with small groups, then why can't we also do that? And he also gave you that sense of empowerment. So thank you, Clyde, for everything. I'll talk about the following few topics. I'll give you a little bit of our EDI trend data over time. We have collected EDI data for over 10 years, almost 15 years, so we can actually look at things happening over time. I'll say a few things about what the research says in general about what differences make a difference when we talk about early child development. I'll emphasize 3 things in particular: connectedness or social relationships, the importance of play, and the importance of certain healthy habits, nutrition and sleep, and so forth. And then the question is, if we know these things in principle, why aren't all our children doing well? So I'll talk a bit about some of the barriers I'm seeing, and of course you've been hearing about before, and a couple of ideas and recommendations in regard to some of the initiatives that may be promising. In that regard, I'm particularly curious to hear what your feedback and questions are. So let's start with the EDI. So as you all know, it's really a reflection of what a large professional group, namely teachers, think about how our kids are doing. So in BC, for the past 15 years, every 2 years on average, we've had the teachers fill out the EDI for all the children. So we basically have the whole population every 2 or 3 years, and we can look at how things changed over time. And this is how it looks. I'll try to unpack the most interesting facets of the EDI trends over time, from 2002 until 2014. So when you just look at overall vulnerability, if you take all the different domains on the EDI and just say for each child, are you vulnerable or not on any of those 5 domains, then we see that the overall vulnerability rate in BC in the beginning, in wave 2, was about 30%. And over the years, it has slowly increased. So now we're at around 33%. So things are not getting better, things are getting worse. There are more children that are vulnerable over time, on average. So when you ask me what are the promising strategies, we're not doing all the right things in BC, and I'll come back to that because I don't want to take the steam out of a lot of initiatives, but the reality is that there are different forces working in different directions, and I'll talk about this in a bit more in detail. So unpacking the trends, I'm not sure how the colors come out. I'll walk you through it anyway with my words. So here's just the language domain, or the language and cognitive development domain. This is what your classic, traditional pre-academic skills are. You know, do you know your numbers? Do you know your words, your vocabularies, and so forth? That's the only domain where we've seen improvements over the last 12 years. If you look at what BC has been doing, is they have poured a lot of money and a lot of initiative into early literacy campaigns. Everything in preschool has to do with early literacy. Everything you see happening in the new all-day preschool, much of it has to do with literacy. So the good news story is if you systematically put your efforts behind something, you can make a change, and this is what you're potentially seeing here, reflected here. The vulnerability rates on that domain went from 12 in the first wave down to about 8%. So fairly significant improvement over the past 12 years. So now let's look at two other domains that went in the opposite direction. This is social domain, social competence, and emotional maturity. They went in the opposite direction. So we started with about 12, 13% vulnerability, and now we're closer to 16 and 17. So things have gotten much worse in regard to children's social and emotional development. These domains are measuring things like anxiety. Are you sad? Are you nervous? Can you control your own emotions? How do you interact with others in the classroom? Are you respectful? Are you pro-social, and so forth? So all the things we want to see in not in every member of society, but the things we particularly want to see children learn when they first come into these more formalized settings like school. So two trends going the different direction. One showing improvement, language and cognitive. Ministry has poured a lot of money. Social, emotional, nothing happening systematically, and we see that things are getting worse over time. So here are the two trends side by side. One interesting statistic that links to this, in my view anyway, has to do with the current mental health crisis. And of course, there's a lot of publicity in different media outlets. But when you look at the mental health crisis and you look at the numbers for depression, anxiety, and so forth, and you then ask the people who are affected by this in adulthood, adolescence, and you ask them, when does this start? 70% of them say, well, sometimes in my adolescence or even in their childhood. Think about this. So these things start very, very early. They may not fully, come out visibly, but this is when these things start. So is this maybe the trend that we're seeing reflected in the emotional and social competence domain? Do they potentially have to do something with the later mental health trajectories? So we know that there are a lot of children who are already affected by different mental health disorders, something like anxiety and depression and so forth. But there's a lot of denial, so that's another important piece of the puzzle. We don't think that children have to deal with this. Yeah, they're so small, they're going to be fine. It's only when, well, this is where it starts. And here's an expert who has reflected on this and said, well, I'm completely amazed how many people don't believe mental illness exists in children. So it's a real taboo. It's not something that's being talked about, that's being acknowledged. And I think our EDI data are picking potentially up some of these trends. So what difference can we make that make a difference in children's development? And this is a reflection on what the research has been saying over the last decades. Before I start, I'll just refer to one resource which I think is excellent. There are two long YouTube videos by Clyde Hertzman on the Dalai Lama Center website. All the links can be shared with the PowerPoint slides. In that, he talks more about the brain development. I'm not going to talk about the brain development so much, but about certain principles in terms of what kinds of interactions and daily experiences really make a difference for children. If you are interested in the brain experience piece, this is an excellent complementary piece, I think. So let's start with connectedness. And here's one of the researchers, child development researchers, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who summarized it up as in as much of a scientific way as you can do it. Every child requires someone in his or her life who's absolutely crazy about them. That's a scientific statement. That's the summary of 50 years of attachment theory. And I'll go through a couple of animal studies and I'll do this to say these are really these are principles that are underlying our DNA, not just human DNA. These are underlying principles of our mammalian nature. You know, we're social beings, and so are a lot of other mammals. And if we understand that these are so fundamental, then we may be also realizing, well, we really have to, as a society, think about, well, where are our priorities? And if we know that these things make a difference, how can we systematically focus these different things? And in many regards, I may be preaching to the choirs, but they're beautiful stories nonetheless, and great resources. That's why I'm sharing this as them. So here's the first one, Love at Guhn Park, a book by Deborah Bloom. This is based on research they've been doing with monkeys. They do some cruel experiments, but the take-home message is, if you're a little monkey and you have a caring mother, then that will help you, or caring caregiver, I should say, more generally speaking. Often it's the mother that's closest, but any caregiver, if they're close to you, they help you to regulate stress, emotions. If you take that away, you can't regulate your stress, you know, so whenever your stress goes into overdrive, you can't down-regulate. And you mess with that during the early years, it's very, very hard or impossible to get back later. So if you don't learn how to regulate your stress during the early years, this is the mental health problems you're facing 15, 20, 30, 40 years later. Here's another very interesting story. Again, very sad. When they manage elephants in Africa, often they separate the young ones and the old ones. Sometimes they even shoot the older ones and they relocate the younger ones into new territories. What happens, you take away these structures, you know, the grandparents, the parents, you sever those, and that, you know, that's sometimes happening in our inner cities for different reasons than what's happening with the elephants, but in principle it's the same. When you sever these social ties, what you see is these elephants become completely aggressive in ways that have never been witnessed before. They're aggressive to their own fellow elephants, they're aggressive to other species, they're aggressive to humans in ways that we have never witnessed before. And many people see comparisons or parallels to how some inner city youth gangs act out when they don't have the social ties to the elders because they have been tied for severed for whatever reason. Very interesting article that came up in the New York Times. And then finally, this is a children's book, which is just beautiful. It's a true story. This is a hippo, which was separated from its parents by a tsunami, and then was taken into this reserve, and they didn't find any other encounter than the one with this old tortoise. The tortoise went like, shh, shh, you know, at first didn't like it and wanted to walk away, but obviously a tortoise can't outrun a hippo. So they stuck together, and the hippo copied everything the tortoise did. So again, the key, the take-home message is, the attachment stuff is not fluff. You know, when we talk about John Bowlby's work in the 70s, which is maybe obvious for a lot of caring parents, was not so obvious for a lot of researchers or people trying to organize and structure society. When he talked about the attachment theory, a lot of people were thinking, well, that's just fluff, that's just stuff, you know. We have an attachment system. If you don't have these social ties, the way our brains are connected, the way our immune system works, the way our stress systems work, all of these things are getting wired in completely different ways. So this is fundamental to our makeup and how we develop. And so all the things you see in these animals, you see completely in parallel in human beings. So to summarize the research, when you have children lacking warm, caring relationships, then they're more likely to be aggressive. They report low well-being. They develop brains that are not as effective in regulating stress and negative feelings and emotions. They have poor immune functioning, and they also, in some instances, show cognitive impairment. This is when it's more severe. So second thing. The importance of play. And again, if I may be preaching to the converted here, but it's so fundamental, and I think it's often underestimated, that what kind of fundamental role play really has for brain development, for children's learning. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about play. And again, parallel to, this is a universal principle. This is not, again, this is something that's part of our mammalian makeup. These are two bears on the west coast of this country, so BC or Alaska, I forgot, but these two researchers, a couple, they went out into the field, they observed all these bears, and they looked at how much these little ones, when they were growing up, were playing. And then they followed them over time and looked at how many of these survived. And those who play the most were the most likely to survive. Other studies looking at the brain size, not overall brain size, but relative brain size, relative size of brain regions with regard to socio-cognitive, motor, emotional, and visual functions. So think of your brain and how much of your brain is dedicated to doing these things as opposed to hunting or hiding, you know, which is crocodile makeup. So how much of your brain is dedicated to these different things? And what you see is the more of your brain is dedicated to these different functions, oops, wrong way, the more you play. So you see the axis going this way. More space in your brain dedicated to social functions, motor function, emotional functions. The more you have that in your brain, the more during your childhood you actually dedicate time of your daily experiences to play. Because it's absolutely essential that all these different functions, they develop during different types of play. So for humans, we know that's of course also true. There's nothing different. And in regard to actual programs for kids, we know that whenever you do social pretend play and developmental theory-based programs that integrate different forms of play, that those have long-lasting and associations with children's social, emotional, and cognitive skills and behavioral outcomes. So we see a very, very strong parallel, and we have seen these findings over and over in the research literature. Here, just a couple of examples. So let me look at a couple more things in regard to nutrition and sleep. Here's a study where they bred identical mice, genetically speaking, but then the only difference between those mice, you can see they obviously look very different, but they're genetically identical. The only thing that differed was the mothers, while they were pregnant with them, got different diets. Everything was the same except for micronutrients like folic acid, certain vitamins and what have you. That was the only difference. And the left one doesn't just look different, it was more likely to be obese, has more diabetes, more cancers. Of course, this is an extreme example based on animal research, but you look at studies with humans and you see parallels again. We know that mother's nutrition is also associated with risk for obesity, diabetes, and cancers and other health outcomes for their offspring. And of course, we know that what we eat during our lifetime, of course, affects our own health, particularly when it comes to refined sugars versus eating more fresh fruit and vegetables, and that those things are related to obesity rates, cavities or dental caries, immune functioning, and cardiovascular health. In the US, the first time that they saw in one state that the obesity rates went down is when the food stamps program was actually funded in a way that they could get fresh fruits and vegetables. And all of a sudden, they saw a decline in that state for obesity rates. So it's quite fundamental, and I often think it's underestimated. Finally, we know that eating is a social affair. So from research with adolescents and children, we know that the more family meals they have. We see less tobacco and alcohol use, we see better school performance, we see less depression symptoms and fewer eating disorders. So there are a lot of different experiences related to eating in terms of what you eat and how and what context you eat it that are related to our development. And then finally, one parallel in regard to sleep. This is again a research study where they sleep-deprived mice, and they found that they suffered a lot of very negative long-term consequences, not just short-term. You're not just tired the next morning. We all know this. If you're sleep-deprived for too long, this can have long-term implications. If this happens during your formative years, it can affect the brain functioning in the long term in terms of cognitive impairment and other functions. And they find some similar things when they do studies with students. Of course, they don't do long-term deprivation, but you see similar signals when you only do it for a short term, and it indicates that sleep loss and deprivation is associated with obesity, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, anxiety, depression, cognitive functioning. So a whole range of different things, not just one particular thing in terms of being tired, but a whole range of mental and physical health outcomes. Okay, so if we know this from all this research, and a lot of people know this intuitively, how come that in BC and in a lot of other areas, our vulnerabilities keep creeping up in certain areas? So the question is, what are the differences we can make, or can we? And so this is now where I'm going to talk about the barriers, because even if many of us may want to be doing these things, we also know that other things may get into the way. So I'll spend just a few minutes talking on this. This is a picture from the Berlin Wall, but now painted. When Clyde was asked the same question, so what's happening in terms of promising things in BC, he said, well, the EDI led to a lot of initiatives. In fact, one doctoral student once counted, there are almost 1,000 different initiatives that people said were just implemented based on EDI findings. So there was a lot of motivation doing something about the data. How come that we still see negative trends in regard to some health outcomes? And he said, well, there's potentially something very large happening to family life. And he talks about some of the research that Paul Kershaw has been doing at the Human Early Learning Partnership, talking about how families these days are very, with children especially, are squeezed for time. They're squeezed for time, they're squeezed for money, and they're squeezed for access and programs and services. So let's just look at this a little bit. You know, here's income inequality today in Canada. So imagine I have $100 for the first row. The first person gets $50. The next 4 get 45, and then for the remaining 5, I have $5 left. That's currently how money is distributed in this country. And there was always some inequality, and I'm not trying to be here on a socialist talk or anything, but the inequality has almost doubled in the last generation. So the gap between the wealthiest and the non-haves has dramatically increased. If you look at child poverty rate, here's a comparison of different countries. So you see that there's quite a range from under 5% in Denmark all the way to over 20% for the US. This is OECD countries. And here's Canada with about 15% child poverty rate. And when you look at the country by province and territory, BC sadly has been leading the statistic from the bottom end of the top of the table. BC is consistently the worst province in terms of childhood poverty, with 19%. The rest of the country is lower, despite the fact that that's one of the wealthiest places in the world. But again, it's income inequality. There's a lot of wealth, but it's not distributed in a way that all the kids have enough resources. 40% of Indigenous children can live in poverty. That's just very sad and scary statistic, and this is, if you want to have the full resource, it's listed here. It was a study by the Center for Policy Alternatives and Save the Children Canada. So it's a question, so we have resources, but it comes partly down to the question, where are our priorities? So if government spending on medical care and pension has grown by billions since 1976, but spending on families with young children has not changed. So again, if there's a lobby, if there's need, if we have priorities, we have been phenomenal as a society to dedicate resources to it, but we don't have the same lobby for children with young families. So the question is, how can we create the same type of advocacy to maybe relocate adequate resources into that direction? Another way of looking at it is, if you think about the government spending on subsidizing livestock and agriculture, it's the same as you get for parental time at home with a new baby. Again, so I'm just saying, well, if we really reflect on this, we have to reflect on our values and where we put resources in a society. And this is not a new topic, of course. The Canadian Parliament has talked about this 25 years ago. They said anonymously we should end poverty, and the numbers have gone up since. Of course, it would be, thank you. Of course, it would be unpopular to say I'm not for eradicating child poverty, but it's a hard thing, and it's not the responsibility of the people who are making decisions as the government, but it's our responsibility as an entire society. So how do we deal with these bigger issues that are potentially going against the things, all the initiatives that are happening on the ground as far as my knowledge is concerned, in BC, for example. Here are other couple resources just to reflect on the fact that it's an actual topical topic in the media. Here's an Globe and Mail article on income inequality from 2013. So now, having reflected on a bigger picture and coming back to the trends, yes, even if there are a lot of things, good things happening on the ground, how do they compare to some of the bigger things in our society that maybe counteract some of the good things that we're all doing in programs, whether it's preschool, whether it's breakfast programs, whether it's play-based daycare and what have you. So the question is, do these declines in emotional maturity and social competence, do these trends reflect the squeeze for time, resources, and services that affect family with young children? I'm not saying I know the answer, because you can't causally make that connection, but it's a valid question because that has been such a universally strong and representative trend in the, not just in BC, but across the country. So how do we overcome barriers? Making child and families a priority, and this is where I'm not saying I know, again, I'm not saying I know the answer, I'm just sharing some ideas. Here's one initiative that's led by a colleague, Paul Kershaw, at the Human Early Learning Partnership at UBC. It's about Generation Squeeze. So he asked the question, how can we mobilize our society in regard to creating more awareness for this squeeze in regard to time, services, and money when it comes to children and their families. There's a website with it if you're interested in getting more information. Some of the stats I presented are from that initiative. So again, the question is, how do we as a society get together, if we all think that's important, to organize ourselves in order to make a difference in that regard, and in this particular case, tackle some of these bigger things. You can also look at it from a child rights perspective. So Ziba Vakri, who was at HELP, she looked into the rights of children and said, well, it's not just an ethical issue or a professional issue or spending issue, it's also a human rights issue. And Canada was actually one of the first countries to sign this Convention of the Rights of the Child. And I just picked a couple one that I thought are interesting. Children have a lot of rights, and the question is, how do they relate to the things we're actually currently providing for children, their young families in our society. They have a right to be listened to, and right to be taken seriously, and they have a right to play and relax by doing things like sports, music, and drama. There's a whole list of other things. I just picked a couple. But again, we can look at this whole issue as a rights issue and ask ourselves, are we really fulfilling the responsibility of providing these things for our children? Here are the resources in case you're interested. They have them in English and French and multiple other languages. Again, Canada was a signatory to this in the 90s, so they have been actually driving this in the beginning. Okay, so 5 minutes. 5, great. So I'll just end with a few things that I think are potentially promising programs, but I say that with a lot of carefulness for the following reasons. When you look at research that looks at programs that are successful, and they evaluate them, and they find, oh, here's a program that works great, and they do a publication in the research literature, and then somebody else comes along and says, oh, this is great, there's an evidence-based program, and they did it in Chicago, so now let's take it to Pittsburgh. And then they do the same thing in Vancouver, or they found this program and it works, so why don't we implement it in Montreal or in wherever? And then they find, oops, it doesn't work. So what's happening here? And I'll come back to this in a second, because there's a social psychology, there's some principles that have to do with involving the people locally that is so fundamentally to the success of these programs that transplanting one program into another context, it may be the best program with everything right, as if it's not building on what you have, and that's what Kathy said earlier, if it's not building on the motivations and what you already have existing in your community, it's not going to work. So that's why I'm saying I'm very, very careful when I refer to these programs. But the reason I do is because some of the things I just mentioned, they actually have as part of their process. You know, they deliberately say, well, when you do this, involve everybody around you. If you want to change if you want to change something for children families, well, involve those children families locally. If you want teachers to change practice, well, then ask them how to do it best. You can't superimpose these programs and expect that they're working. I just read that a couple of days ago, apparently this is changing. So I was just going to say, well, we have a great example that in Quebec we have already one of these things that can be done, implemented. Of course, it's still good in terms of daycare cost. You compare the daycare cost in different cities across the country, and you see that for this monthly, for Quebec, it's in the low hundreds, and for most other provinces and territories, it's over 1,000. So at UBC, you pay $1,300 per month per child for daycare. So you do the math, how much that takes a bite out of your salary and how much you have left for housing and food and what have you. Play-based daycare and kindergarten. I picked the Ontario example. I know that they're in many places, but they have good documentation on that, and probably other places have too. But I hope this is taken very seriously. You get very different opinions when you talk to practitioners on the ground on how this is actually being implemented. There's a lot of pressure, often from parents. They say, well, at the end of the day, I want my kids to know their numbers and their math, because that's what the academic achievement test will do in grade 4 and 7 and 10. That's what will get them in university. How many of you learned math and literacy when you were 4 or 5? Everybody in my generation in Germany started 6. And even then it was like, 2 puppets talking, 2 words. And we played all day. I'm not trying to interpolate from my own experience. I'm just saying, as a generation, as a society, we haven't done this to kids just a generation ago, but now there's this pressure. I often wonder where it's coming from, because people say, well, we can't change it. Well, it changed completely within a generation, that there's this immense pressure on 4-year-olds to know all these things. So just let them play. There's all the evidence, and I think it's a good description in there, but we have to really be serious about letting them play in the multiple ways children need to play. There are a couple more resources, and I could have listed others, but because there's so many multiple ways of having children play, it's of course really insightful to read some of the resources that talk about it in detail for the different age groups with examples and the philosophy underlying it and so forth. There's a program, this is from Ontario as well, Better Beginnings, Better Futures. Ray Peters was the one who evaluated it. And this is a whole holistic community-based intervention program for early children and their families. And they try to address all the different things, whether it's poverty, whether it's nutrition, whether it's playtime, so it's very holistic. And I'm not going to talk about too many details about the actual program, but I'm saying there are these initiatives, they're around. One of the key lessons, I'll come to that in a second again for the other one. One of the key lessons is that this is community-based. When they make these decisions, they involve the families, they involve the children. They show that with much less than Head Start costs, with about $1,000 per child per year, they can gain a lot of positive outcomes for these children. So it's very effective, it's very efficient, it's not that expensive, it's very holistic, but again, one of the main principles is that they very closely involve local people. There's another example of an initiative from BC, child-friendly communities, building child-friendly communities. In essence, the principle is, well, we have built cities around cars and transportation for the last 50 years. How do we change it, build them around families with children and seniors, and putting a senior residence next to a kindergarten and making it walkable and so forth. So this is basically this initiative. Again, they're very, very clear on involving the local community and going about this. So here's some of the key lessons. Local control is absolutely essential. That's the social psychology underplaying this. It's good to have different sectors involved. You often can't do it by yourself. Involve health, education, transportation, you name it. You have to have access resources to resources. You can't do it without. What Kathy said, if it's evidence-based, it's essential, and So make sure you use the information that's either local or from generic research to inform your programs and practices. And then again, you have to involve the people who you are trying to affect in regard to your different initiatives. So with that, I'm done and the rest good for questions. Thank you. Yeah.